Greetings. I hope all of you are having a great day today. And this is the last of the mini lectures on the Constitution. And we really only have one thing left to finish up our discussion of the Constitution, and that is the amendment process. So when the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were debating whether the Constitution should be ratified or not, remember, in essence, one last great compromise sealed the deal. And the compromise, of course, was that the Federalists offered the compromise. The Federalists asked the Anti Federalists to adopt the Constitution. And if the Constitution were ratified, they then would add a Bill of Rights, which today are usually known as our first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Both critics of the Constitution and people who are real fans of the Constitution tend to agree that the fact that there was a mechanism to allow the Constitution to be ratified, that made the document a far better one. However, in practice, think about this. In practice, we now have had the same Constitution in operation for over 230 years, and there have only been 27 amendments added to the Constitution. You should know that number. One of the questions in the test bank will be how many amendments have been added to the Constitution, and it's 27. So 27 amendments in over 230 years means that on average, one amendment has been added on average less than every decade. And in fact, there has not been an amendment added to the Constitution since 1992. So for most people listening to this mini lecture, there has not been a constitutional amendment added in your lifetime. And unless you were born before 1972, there has only been that one amendment added. So it doesn't happen very often. And so the obvious question is, well, gosh, why is it so difficult? It's not difficult to propose a constitutional amendment. In fact, it's estimated there have been a little over 12,000 constitutional amendments that have been proposed. So when you think about that, 12,000 proposals, and yet only 27 have been added, this must be a really, really, really difficult test. And it is. So if you follow along in your notes, to change the Constitution, there is a difficult two-stage process. And even though when you take a look at the fractions, it appears that the second part should be the harder part of this process, that isn't true. So the first step in the process is usually called the proposal stage. So where it says first, two-thirds majorities in both houses of Congress must pass an amendment. So it shouldn't be pass and, it should be pass an amendment to the states for ratification. So, okay, so there have been approximately 12,000, I'll just round that number off, 12,000 proposals, and yet only 33 or 34 have gone out to the states for ratification. So this is the part of the process where amendments have usually died. And let me give you the last really, really near miss. In fact, it is as close a near miss as is possible. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1989 made a very controversial decision. We're going to talk about this Supreme Court case later. The Supreme Court case is called Texas versus Johnson. And the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 margin in that case, ruled that flag burning is constitutionally protected symbolic speech under the Constitution. I talked earlier about checks and balances, separation of powers, and here's an excellent example. The most obvious way to check the Supreme Court is if the Supreme Court rules that something's unconstitutional, then the response is to change the Constitution. So many years ago in 1895, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal income tax was unconstitutional, Congress in the states ratified a new amendment, the 16th Amendment, that provides for the federal income tax. So in this case, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that flag burning was constitutionally protected by the First Amendment, the vast majority of Americans, about 70% of Americans, thought the Supreme Court had made the wrong decision, and they began lobbying Congress to change the Constitution. Even though I am saddened by flag burning, I think the Supreme Court made the right decision, and I'll tell you when we get to the First Amendment under civil liberties later. There were 5 attempts to change the Constitution over the next 7 or 8 years or so. And on every occasion, on all 5 occasions, the House of Representatives passed the amendment by more than a 2/3 margin. So the House of Representatives passed the proposed amendment. And so what that means is the place where the amendment died all 5 times was in the Senate. There are 100 senators. 2/3 of the Senate is 67. So the magic number that was needed to send this amendment to the states for ratification was 67. The closest of those 5 votes to amend the Constitution was 66 to 34. That's right. That means that the constitutional amendment failed by 1 vote in the Senate. Now, what would have happened? What if the vote had been 67 to 33? Well, in that particular case, the amendment would have gone out to the states. And I have no doubt in my mind that if that constitutional amendment had gone out to the states, it would have been ratified in record time. And the reason that I say that is before the Supreme Court ruled that flag burning was constitutionally protected, 48 of the 50 states had state laws banning the flag from being burned, or what the court called being desecrated. So I have no doubt in my mind that the states who had already passed laws banning flag burning would have very quickly ratified that amendment. To ratify a constitutional amendment, we get what's called the ratification stage, and that's second, right? The ratification stage is 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment, which adds it to the Constitution. And even though on paper 3/4 seems to be harder than 2/3, right? If there are math majors out there, you're going, well, Randall, that sounds crazy. Only 2/3 of the states, that's 67%, 66.6 actually, and 3/4, 75%. But historically, when constitutional amendments have gone to the states have actually ratified them about 80% of the time. In other words, if a constitutional amendment does make it to the state for ratification, the states have ratified 4 out of 5 times, which is incredibly high. Let me give you the highest profile example of an amendment being defeated in the states. This was one of the most hot button issues when I was a teenager. There was a proposed amendment that had been proposed for many, many years. The constitutional amendment was first proposed in 1923 in Congress, and it failed. And in 1924, and it failed. And in 1925, and it failed. You get the idea. On the 49th try in 1972, this amendment was passed by 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. So finally, an amendment that had been proposed since the 1920s finally makes it out of Congress in the 1970s. To me, this amendment was very simple. It was very straightforward. To me, I honestly don't understand how there could be any opposition to this. The amendment was very simple and short, and it read quite simply: equality of rights shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And this proposed amendment was called the Equal Rights Amendment. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about gender equity when we get to civil rights. But this amendment went out to the states, and 38 states were required to ratify it. The Congress gave this amendment 7 years to be passed by the states, which is an unusually large time, because other than the 26th Amendment, which laid in dormancy for over 200 years, it was actually supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights, the 26th Amendment, which in essence says that if there is a pay raise for Congress, that pay raise does not take effect until after an election. You can see how that fit into checks and balances. If Congress votes itself a raise, the people get to check it by voting on whether they stay in office or not. That amendment was originally proposed as part of the Bill of Rights. It was not ratified, but the Bill of Rights did not originally have a time limit, and so that amendment was brought back to life in the late 80s and was ratified in 1992. Other than that one, every other amendment was passed in between 4 months and 3 years and 11 months. So the thought was 7 years would be plenty of time for the Equal Rights Amendment to be passed. 30 states ratified the amendment the very first year, so it looked like this amendment was going to sail through. It wasn't going to be a problem, and then all hell broke loose, especially in southern states. And in one of those weird ironies, probably the two best known opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment were two very conservative Christian Republican women, Anita Bryant and Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis Schlafly formed an interest group called Eagle Forum, which was largely designed to kill this amendment. To make a very long and interesting story short, by the end of the 7 years, only 35 of the 38 required states had ratified the amendment. And so the amendment died. And it's really an interesting turn of events because both a majority of Democrats and Republicans were in favor of this amendment. More than 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress were in favor of this amendment. 70% of the states were in favor of this amendment. And yet the amendment died because a small number of states, in this case 15, did not ratify this amendment. And this is another example of how our system is very conservative, it's very status quo oriented, and it is one of a few ways in which an entrenched minority can thwart the will of the majority. What you need to know for exam purposes are two things. One, there have been 27 amendments added to the Constitution, which to me demonstrates how remarkably few amendments have been added. There have been, I believe, about 600 amendments added to the California Constitution, for example. So there's a nice compare and contrast. So know that there have been very few amendments passed, only 27 of them, and you should also know that in order to pass a constitutional amendment, it requires 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify it and turn it into law. So this is the end of the second module on the Constitution. In the next mini lecture, we will start our next module, and in fact, this will be the last module for the first exam. This will be a module on federalism, which I find to be an incredibly interesting topic. See you again soon.